Hello and welcome to the Just and Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. And I just want to give you all a quick reminder, as always, that the program and the organization that we run is donor supported. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means any gifts that you give us are tax deductible. You can go to justincenter.org, go to our webpage there, and click on the donate tab, and you can donate to us. You can also support us through Patreon, and you could support us through purchasing some of our books. You can go to jspublishing.org, and that is where you can find a number of the publications that we put out. Well, we're continuing this series that we have just started recently, Makers of the Modern World. And we have been discussing Marxist thinkers as the kind of first group of thinkers we'll be looking at. We'll be going far beyond that. But we started with Karl Marx, and then I really wanted to jump into the topic of the Frankfurt School, or what's known as critical theory. But before doing that, I decided to look a little bit at Georg Lukács, because he is very much a kind of intermediary figure between these two schools of thought, how we get from Marx to now the Frankfurt School and the development of what's called critical theory. So if you haven't watched the Lukács video or listened to the podcast, the audio of the Lukács lecture, I would recommend doing that first, because I think it will set a lot of the groundwork that we're going to be covering here as we look at the Frankfurt School. So we're going to be talking today about the Frankfurt School, named after Frankfurt, Germany. And there are a number of figures associated with the Frankfurt School who are all rather significant and influential. And at what's called the Institute for Social Research, there are a number of individuals with all kind of different ideas that are part of that school. But generally, when we're talking about the Frankfurt School, there are a few select individuals that we're discussing, that people generally are thinking of under that title. And that would be Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and Herbert Marcuse would be the top three most significant figures. We also have Walter Benjamin, who's often associated with the Frankfurt School as well. And his ideas are kind of unique. And really, even between those three kind of major figures that I mentioned, there are differences on a lot of issues, actually. And Jürgen Habermas is also a very significant figure who comes out of this school, but then departs from it. So Habermas really should be treated on his own. I wouldn't really tend to lump him in with the other figures that we're going to be looking at. Now, if we're going to look at any of these figures, I could spend the whole hour lecture on any one of these thinkers. Honestly, I could just spend an hour lecture on any of these figures on one singular topic, because they wrote very extensively on all sorts of topics and very much related things. But this goes from aesthetics to economics to psychology, the nature of the ego, the family. And as we look at critical theory, what we're going to see is critical theory posits itself really as a theory of everything. And in some ways, these authors really did attempt to do that. So they wrote on so many various fields of thought, but coming from a more broadly Marxist tradition. So I, in this talk, am going to be focusing mostly on Theodor Adorno. Now, I could have done this talk centered on either of those other two figures that I mentioned, or Benjamin as well. I could have focused on him, and he had a kind of major rise in influence after these figures did, even though he was around there was a bit of a renaissance of his writings. But I've chosen to focus on Adorno. Now, we're going to be looking at the other figures as well, but the discussion will be centered on Theodor Adorno. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Theodor Adorno. We'll talk about his life. We will be looking at Marcuse as well, and Horkheimer wrote with Adorno their most significant works, so we'll be looking at him some as well. But let's start with Theodor Adorno, who's our point of departure for this talk here. His dates you can see there, 1903 to 1969. So he died relatively young at 66 years old. He was born on September 11th, 1903 in Frankfurt, Germany, where we get the name the Frankfurt School, because that was the center of these thinkers. And we see, very similar to the other figures in the Marxist tradition that we have looked at already, he is also of Jewish ancestry, and his father converted to Protestantism. So we've seen this is a theme. This shows up now in all three of the figures that we have looked at, being Marx, Lukács, and now Adorno. all of them were of Jewish ancestry, and all of their fathers had converted to Protestantism. So it's a bit odd how this cycle seems to like recapitulate with these various figures. His father was a wealthy wine merchant. Again, we see that his father was a wealthy man. Another similarity between these figures. So we see, as we continue to within the Marxist tradition, that the Marxist leaders and thinkers who speak so highly of the proletariat and speak about the proletariat as kind of being the only standard of truth and goodness, they themselves are not part of that class. So Adorno as well was not part of that class. His father was quite wealthy. And you can see that he's not part of the proletariat as you look at the kinds of things he was reading at a very young age. So as a teenager, Adorno is reading Lukács and Ernst Bloch. So he is an intellectual. Already as a teenager, he has access to this kind of revolutionary literature, communist literature. So he's interested in revolutionary movements even at a young age. And we see this also with the rest of these Marxist figures. They all tend to have become interested in revolutionary ideas as teenagers, as very young people. And that, I think, kind of just makes sense as you look around at, college campuses and even at rebellious maybe movements of high schoolers. It does seem to be at that age that people want revolution. They want to change things. They're frustrated with the world. And sometimes a teenage desire for something like that can lead to a lifelong career in politics, and radical politics is what we're talking about here. But Adorno is a bit different from some of these other thinkers and some of these other figures in that really his area of expertise was not at all politics. He was a musician. He was an accomplished musician at quite a young age. He was also a composer. He wrote several pieces of music. Throughout his career, he wrote several articles on music. He wrote reviews of performances and pieces of various composers. I think about, it's more than 50% of his actual published writings. I think it was about 60% of those are within the field of music theory, music reviews. So that really is his area of expertise rather than economics or politics. As we're going to see, Adorno really liked avant-garde music in terms of music that was popular in his own age. We'll see that he was quite critical of mass culture. He first uses the term mass culture and then changes that term, and we'll talk about that. But that which was popular, we're thinking of the rise of jazz. He hates jazz, and he's got an essay on jazz, which is very poor, but and hasn't been received well. But he's a critic of jazz and the rise in popular music and the rise of the cinema and all sorts of other things, because he liked music or art forms that pushed the envelope to some degree, not things that were overtly political per se, but things that would bring people a longing for something that is new. And avant-garde music in his day was really the only thing that he saw as doing that in any way. He's actually critical of some avant-garde music for going too far in his view, but he also writes a lot about classical composers. He has an essay on Beethoven, he has one on Bach. Those are the two that I read and I'm familiar with, but I know he wrote others as well. And you can find a lot of these writings. Okay, let's see. He transitioned from music to then the area of philosophy and aesthetics. So he's generally within the realm of the arts and looking at a philosophical approach to the arts. So in his career, it appears that he's going to just be a musician. I mean, it seems like that's where his career is going initially, and then he extends beyond that and gets more philosophically rooted. So Adorno, in his philosophical studies, then eventually studies for a PhD, and he decides for his studies to look at Søren Kierkegaard, another figure that we're going to be looking at hopefully in the series, who's known as the father of existentialism in many ways. He studied under Paul Tillich, which is interesting, and he finishes this in 1931. Paul Tillich, if you're not familiar with him, is one of the most important theologians of the 20th century. I think an extremely poor theologian, but he is a very influential one. Adorno then left Germany for the United States in 1934. As he is Jewish, things in Germany are starting to get quite difficult for the Jewish people with the rise of the Nazi Party. So the Frankfurt School, a lot of these figures we've already talked about a little bit, left Germany. And first he lives in New York City, And then he goes to the West Coast in Los Angeles. And his time in LA really does form him in quite significant ways. He sees the heart of Hollywood, and he is extremely disheartened. And that would be, to put it quite mildly. In some ways, he sees the culture of Hollywood in the United States as really not much better than the culture of the German people, leading to the rise of Nazism. He sees it as a kind of authoritarian captivity in some way through the production of culture, rather than not through kind of state coercion, but he sees something similar going on in the United States in his view. So he's really, really harsh. I'm critical of Hollywood in many ways, but I'm not quite sure that I would say that Hollywood, especially of the 1930s, was equivalent to Nazi Germany. Well, he then joins the Institute for Social Research, which is the school that is known as the Frankfurt School. And so this is where critical theory is developed. He joins the Institute in 1945, and he was really at the center of the Frankfurt School. Horkheimer was the leader of the Frankfurt School at that time, and then he, Adorno, became the director in 1958. Adorno was also very influential in the 1960s. Now, he died, as we said, in the 1960s, but through the rise of student movements, protest movements, liberation movements of various kinds in the 1960s, Adorno becomes a bit of a kind of celebrity figure in some circles. So we see that he has an impact upon very practical revolutionary movements. And we see this with the Frankfurt School in general, is that it is going to have real-world impact on the student movements of that era. And, historians, sociologists often talk about the 1960s as quite a turning point in the Western world, where you do have this shift because of the hippie movement and various other things, that the mindset and the values of the West begin to be questioned. Now, there are a number of things that lead to this. You have the sexual revolution and Alfred Kinsey and Freud's theories that certainly play a significant role there. But one of the factors in that major shift that we see culturally in the 1960s is through the Frankfurt School. He dies in 1969, just prior to the publication of his aesthetic theory. And actually, he died just prior to the publication, not because it was to be published in 1970, but just because it was actually not finished. But after his death, they quickly kind of put out what he had put together. So aesthetic theory sometimes is said to be his best work, especially within the field of aesthetics. And those of you who listen to me very much probably know that I have an interest in the field of aesthetics, and I do a lot of reading on philosophical aesthetics, theological aesthetics, and the questions of art and the meaning of art. And Adorno is one of these figures who, in his writing aesthetic theory, he shows up in everything. Everyone who deals with the question of aesthetics somehow has to reckon with Adorno because he's that significant in that field. So we're not just talking about a revolutionary political figure, but we are also talking about an aesthetician who is extremely influential in that field. Now, let's talk a bit, before we jump into Adorno's ideas and the ideas of critical theory more specifically, the relationship of critical theory to Marxism. And so we can ask the question, is critical theory, or is the Frankfurt School, is this a Marxist movement? Or does it differ fundamentally from Marxism in significant ways? Well, if you look at a lot of kind of older scholarship, it was often the case that writers tended to distance the Frankfurt School from Marxism. I think that was likely done at the time to try to defend the Frankfurt School because Marxism generally has a bad name, and I think rightly so. But there has increasingly been in scholarship just an admittance and an acceptance of the fact that they were Marxist thinkers. They were not identical with the thoughts of Karl Marx. They bring in various other fields into their study, but the foundation is fundamentally Marxist. So I just have one quote from the Routledge Handbook of Marxism and Post-Marxism. Henry Pickford says, "Adorno and other members of the Frankfurt School took themselves to belong to the Marxist tradition." So they are self-professed Marxists. So that handbook actually just came out very recently. So that's just the newest scholarship that I have had access to and looked at in the various places I looked. Okay, so they differed, however, from Marx on some pretty significant points. And here is the major point that we are going to see that Marxists as a whole tend to reject at this time, and that is that they begin to reject the scientific socialism of Marx. As we talked about in our talk on Marx, Marx believed that as the world developed, as a result of physical processes, it was just the inevitable development of human societies that societies would move from capitalism to socialism. And I've used the analogy before that it's just like the human person growing up. Just as a child is inevitably going to lose their baby teeth and grow adult teeth, as most children do, that's just the expected life of the organism. It develops in such a way that the life of a system of politics, of the social sphere, is going to develop in a similar way, that there is just this inevitability scientifically, that this is just how this develops. So things are going to naturally develop into socialism. So we call that a scientific socialism. And that scientific socialism is quickly, maybe not too quickly, but by many, rejected relatively soon after Marx, because Marx was very clear that these socialist revolutions, that this inevitability of the collapse of capitalism was not happening nearly as quickly as he had predicted. And so things were just simply not happening. Now, we do have the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. At this point, however, it had become very clear among many Western thinkers, especially in Western Europe, that this also led to authoritarianism. And the Bolshevik Revolution was not the kind of socialist revolution that they had been hoping for because of the authoritarian nature of Lenin and Leninism as a whole. And yes, I know some people tried to say that it was actually Stalin and not Lenin, but Lenin did some pretty horrific things himself. But so because of that, they're starting to see that this revolution maybe is not as inevitable as it would have seemed to be. Now, a lot of the Bolsheviks expected that once that revolution happened, it would be followed by all these other revolutions and all of the Western world would be radically changed rather quickly. But we had socialist parties in Italy and other places dying out pretty quickly and not being successful. So they're rejecting this necessity of socialism. However, they believe that Marx is essentially correct in his examination of the economy and in his critique of capitalism. So they start speaking in Marxist terminology, but they're broadening this beyond the purely what Marx referred to as a scientific field. And I think we would probably question how scientific such an idea actually was. But they start to broaden Marx's concerns into the fields of sociology, psychology, and art. Those are the three major ones that we see through the Frankfurt School. It does develop in other fields as well. But sociology, largely through the works and appropriation of the ideas of Max Weber. Through psychology, largely through Freud. You have two figures that are very influential upon the Frankfurt School, who are both Freudian psychologists. So you have Erich Fromm, who's actually associated with the Frankfurt School for a while, and then departs from the Frankfurt School because he becomes less of a Freudian and less of a Marxist. And so the figures in the Frankfurt School actually start writing some very critical things about him. And then the second major figure that is influential from a Freudian approach is Wilhelm Reich. And what Reich does is essentially takes Freud's psychoanalysis of the individual ego and then applies it in broader social relations. So we get a kind of social Freudianism out of Reich's work. So those two individuals end up becoming quite influential on bringing together the field of psychology into Marxist criticism. And then, of course, the field of art. As we've already said, Adorno is himself really an aesthetician. He's a musician. The arts are really his field, but that doesn't mean that just Adorno is commenting on arts. And so we start to see that there actually are many divergent approaches to how we should approach the arts from a critical theory perspective. So we have the perspective of Adorno. Horkheimer differs slightly from him. Then we have Walter Benjamin, and Benjamin really departs quite radically from the other thinkers. Then we have Herbert Marcuse as well, who has a different take on the arts. So we could spend a long time just talking about perspectives on the arts and aesthetics here, but we won't do that too much in this talk, but we'll address it a little bit as we go on, but mostly from Adorno's perspective. Okay, so in all of these fields, we're now bringing in Marx's insights. Marx becomes the foundational structure that they are now building on in these various ways, though without the scientific socialism. We see, as I mentioned last time in the last talk on Lukács, that now Marxist thinkers tend to be focusing much more on the early Marx, the more Hegelian Marx, than the later Marx. This actually then ends up shifting in about the 1960s to where everybody's now focusing on the later Marx instead of the early Marx. But it tends to be that the Hegelian, early, more philosophical Marx is the place where these individuals go. Following Marx, Adorno argues that class is defined by place and process of production. So here's where we see when they're talking about class conflicts and they're speaking about things like aesthetics or psychology in relation to class, they are defining class in a very narrowly Marxist sense. That the question of class is not just so much how big your house is, how much money you make, or something like that, but class is what is your place in the process of production. Are you one that oversees production, controls production, because that's the bourgeoisie, or are you one that simply produces and they take, the excess, they skim off the top, even though they're not the ones actually doing the working. So that's the way the classes are divided up. And we start to see that eventually what Marcuse is going to do is he defines the proletariat not just as working class, but largely as white-collar, middle-class people. And I think there are problems there significantly, but it's important to recognize that shift because essentially, if all you're talking about is the place in the process of production, if you have a good salary, but you're still not really in control of production, you're working for a company, you're basically just told what to do and paid for it, then you're still in that class, if you're defining class in this particular way that Marxists do. So one of the characteristics that we see of the critical theory school is that they are anti-modernism in some ways. Okay, so not in every sense are they critical of modernity, but they are particularly critical of certain aspects of the German idealist tradition, really starting with Kant and then onward. And so Adorno and Horkheimer produce a text called The Dialectic of Enlightenment in 1947. This is a very influential book, and if you are looking at important books written by the Frankfurt School, this is probably going to show up at the top of the list here. Okay, so in some ways, we could say that critical theory is a precursor to postmodernity. That doesn't mean that it's identical to postmodernity in every way. And I plan on doing some lectures on postmodernity as well, looking at Derrida and Foucault at least, and probably Lyotard and others. But it's a precursor to postmodernity in some ways, that there is a criticism of the rationalism of the post-Enlightenment West leading into modernity. And largely, this criticism comes from the reality of the Holocaust. And so the criticism says, essentially, that in modernity, we have the growth of reason, supposedly, the triumph of reason, as it has been described. And with the triumph of reason, now technologies have grown. There's a lot of criticism in Adorno and Horkheimer. Technologies have grown, and we have been able to manipulate and control nature in ways that we had not before. But whereas the Enlightenment had this very positive perspective on rationality, and a lot of 19th century thinkers were so positive about Western Europe and things are just increasingly getting better, that just didn't happen because now we just watched the Holocaust occur, and in the Holocaust we had one of the greatest horrors that we've ever seen in the world. And so how do we deal with that? I would say that we saw the same with communist Russia as well. With the Bolshevik Revolution, had similar kinds of horrific death tolls, actually higher than that of Nazi Germany. But as rationality seemingly has grown, now all of a sudden the 20th century has seen more deaths than we've ever seen in the past. So people start to question how we've thought about rationality, because maybe we're really not coming to this kind of utopian conclusion at this point. Now, they tend to actually still be utopian in some sense, and at least Marcuse is. Adorno is to some extent, and that shifts later in life. But they see that we're not seeing the progress that we expected to see. And especially for those who are more devoted to the philosophy of Hegel, they're looking at this kind of upward trend of the West, but all of a sudden, technology and the growth in reason and scientific understanding has led to just mass death. Okay. So they are critical of the Enlightenment, and we may, from my perspective, as a, classicist, as a Christian, I have also been plenty critical of the Enlightenment and Kant and Neo-Kantianism as well. So I would say that they are properly understanding certain things, right? So some of the critiques that you find in Adorno are right, and I think you'll see this throughout Adorno's writings, is that he grabs onto what are genuine problems, but his solutions are, I think, wildly wrong. So in my perspective, he has grabbed onto real problems throughout his writings. That's why Adorno is far more interesting, in my view, than any other real Marxist writer. I think Adorno I take far more seriously than I do other Marxist writers, because though I profoundly disagree with the conclusions that he comes to, he does put his finger on some real problems with the modern world. But he doesn't have the philosophical and theological tools to really address those questions well. That would at least be my argument that I would put forth. But he does point out some valid critique. So, of course, he's right about modernity. And we see that the hopefulness of mankind in this, progressive rationalization of Western Europe and the United States has now led to mass destruction in horrible ways. But while he is a critic of the Enlightenment, he is also a critic of ancient Greek philosophy, and he's a critic of Scripture. And when he critiques Scripture, he often does it based upon the Old Testament, and that's because of his own Jewish background, though again, he does have a Protestant context because his father did convert to Protestantism. So he is not critiquing the Enlightenment and saying, let's go back to a kind of classicist approach. He's rejecting that as well. And he's trying to formulate something new as an answer. And that's the question, is does he really give an answer that is satisfying? And there's where I will say no. A leading problem that Adorno sees as he is thinking through these issues, especially the rise of fascism and Nazism, is he's thinking about the question of domination. Because he's seen that with Enlightenment rationality, the more we have grown in our knowledge of the natural world, the more we have begun to dominate nature. We have seen ourselves not as part of nature, but as those who can take nature and conform it to whatever we want. Nature is kind of our slave, and we are the masters. And so we see there is this kind of threefold domination. So there's first the domination of nature by human beings. There's a domination of nature within each of us subjectively. So there's the kind of corporate aspect, there's the subjective aspect, and we could talk about things like a projection that then becomes part of this as we project parts of ourselves onto nature. Then we see that there is a domination of some human beings by others. And that's what we see in the 20th century. That people just start to dominate other people. If we dominate nature and we can control nature, we can dominate and take charge and power over other people as well. So then let's talk more broadly about his approach to reason. And this shows up in the same text. So we're going to expand in this section on what we've already just talked about. So this critique that he writes is a critique of instrumental reason. So what is instrumental reason? They're not saying reason, Adorno and Horkheimer are not saying that reason is always bad. And they're not saying everything about the Enlightenment was bad. They're talking about something very particular. So by instrumental reason, we're really talking, as we're talking about domination here, reason as it is used to gain power and to dominate. And this is really defined as, we have, specifically they're critics of positivism. Again, rightly so. I would also critique positivism for similar reasons. But they say that we have now begun to use reason to figure out means rather than reason to find ends. So reason has, led to the development of the nuclear weapon, which is a means that we can use to dominate somebody else. But we haven't used reason in this Enlightenment stance of instrumental reason to deal with the more important ethical questions of, should we develop nuclear bombs? So we've thought about the ends. We use reason to gain whatever it is that we want. We use it to take mastery over other things. So here he's drawing largely on Friedrich Nietzsche, and we see this in Nietzsche's approach to power, that for Nietzsche, everything is really power. Just like it is in Foucault, this shows up in a number of figures, and they do different things with it, but there is, in figures from Nietzsche onward, a focus on power in philosophical and ethical discourse. So for Nietzsche, power is brought about by reason. We use reason for the purpose of power. So reason means if I use my brain well, I can gain mastery over things. So I am not just this disinterested party wanting to know the world and wanting to understand the objective, validity of things, the objective reality of the essences that exists of God and what he has done to create nature, so I could contemplate and enjoy what is true and rejoice in what is true. Instead, this simply brings power. So that I learn things so that I can have power over other people, and I learn things so that I can have power over things to manipulate things. And so in Adorno's view, and Horkheimer, so for Horkheimer and Adorno, reason can now be used to make the conclusion that one stands over and above nature. And they would say this is mistaken. Because for Horkheimer and Adorno, this is the problem with a lot of Enlightenment thought, is that man becomes what we would say is the transcendental I, and we'll talk about that in the next slide, but the I that is separated. The person is something totally separate from nature, and we have this objective view of nature. I am viewing this thing that is other from me when I am looking at nature. But for Adorno and Horkheimer, they say, no, we are actually part of nature. We are not other than nature. When we see ourselves as totally apart from or above nature, this now leads us to say, I have mastery over nature, and now I can destroy and I can oppress. So here is where this term projection shows up. Projection is a psychological term. We'll see this in Freud in different ways. But what they're saying is you use projection to refer to how someone projects, say, the anger that they feel at something else. So psychologically, we see this, if somebody is very, insecure, say, they may project those insecurities onto other people. It may affect how they treat or speak to other people, or the things they say or view in other people. Like, I'm angry and I view you as angry because I'm projecting my anger onto you. So we do that, Adorno says, but we do that with relation to nature, so that we project our negative feelings to nature itself instead of recognizing them as our own. And this is part of our division between the self and nature in which the self participates in. And then another aspect of Adorno and Horkheimer that's important is that they are interacting with the way specifically that Kant views reason. And Kant becomes the most significant figure, really, in Germany, in the Enlightenment, in terms of how he approaches things like reason and freedom. Everybody really deals with Kant in one way or another, much like they do Hegel. And Kant, if you know anything about Kant's perspective on the world, the one thing that you probably need to know more than anything else, this is a bit of a simplification, is that you have the division of reality into really two separate realms, we may say. You have the noumenal and the phenomenal. The noumenal is the thing in itself, which is how the German is usually translated. The thing in itself, so what a thing really is in and of itself, that's the objective world. But then you have the phenomenal world. The phenomenal world is the world as it appears to me. So the phenomenal world is how I encounter the world. So it's not really the thing as it is in itself. Like, I can't know, I have, say this light here in front of me that's giving me light so that I can record this and it won't look really dark because it's super cloudy out and the window in front of me isn't getting much light in here. So this light in the noumenal would be whatever that actually is in itself. Well, I don't know what the light is in itself. All I know is how I'm encountering it. So I know how my eyes visualize the light that is coming toward me. I know the feel of the pole of the lamp as I touch it. those kinds of things. So I know it in terms of my own sense perception, what my senses perceive, not the thing as it is in himself. So that is the difference between the noumenal realm thing in itself and the phenomenal realm thing as I subjectively encountered, or my experience with it. So in that perspective, the objective world is not something that we can really know as it is. But people start to talk about the objective world. If you go back to, the ancient Greeks, say, they had a perspective on the world that was called realism, that says that we actually do have access to what things are in themselves. We have access by the nature of our minds to essences. So if I see something that is a triangle, I may not know everything about that particular object, but my mind understands what triangularity is, and the thing that's in my mind and the thing that shares in, which is triangularity, are the same, which means I actually can understand the real world. Like, it makes sense. My mind connects to it, really. And Adorno takes a lot of Kant's developments in terms of this question, which we would call, which I'm calling Kant's nominalism, meaning that we don't know the world as it is in itself. We only know it through our sense perception and through the categories that we create to kind of categorize things so it makes sense to us. And Adorno puts this within the context of human evolution and says, well, this whole concept of there being this objective world, this thing in itself, which we are standing above, that we can control and really understand, in his view. He says this really is an evolutionary reality that has developed this within us. So that it's really this result for a need for survival that we create this objective world that then we can dominate. But it's not really telling us anything about what reality actually is in itself. It's just a fact of human origins and human ancestry and biological evolution that we come to the conclusion that the objective world actually exists. So really, the notion of the objective world is really more pragmatic than it is us really accessing some kind of truth that we have some kind of access to, really. Okay, so drawing on Kant then, and this is a quote from the very short introduction to Adorno. It's in the Oxford Very Short Introduction series. Fantastic. I mentioned the critical theory book in that series is awful, but the Adorno one, which also is very new, this just came out recently, it's a very, very helpful volume. Not the easiest thing to read if you're not that acquainted with these categories, but still a really helpful volume. So drawing on Kant, Adorno, here's the quote, located objectivity in the subject's thinking rather than seeing it as inherent in the world. This is key. And I would say this is key to understanding the whole problem of the Enlightenment and modernity, and postmodernity is simply another iteration of this, and critical theory is essentially another iteration of this. That Adorno has not differed really from Kant. Adorno has really not understood the real problem in the rise of modernity. The real problem being that with the rise of nominalism and modern philosophy, starting with Descartes, but in many ways mediated through Kant, nobody can really understand the world as it is. That objectivity is just in our brains. It's not real. That is, to me, the root of the errors of the modern world in many ways. Is this idea that we don't have objective access to truth in the real world. It's just all here in our heads, and we then kind of interpret the world as if it had this objective validity, but that really just comes from our heads. Which means we don't see real meaning objectively in the world. We don't see God's purposes in the world. We now have to create purposes in ourselves and then force them onto the world. And Adorno has a different way of doing this than, say, the existentialists do, or the postmodernists do, or Kant does, but they all do it in their own ways. But they're all have the same fundamental conviction at the very bottom of it, which is the rejection of the classical understanding of truth. Okay, then he owes to Kant that the world should not be understood theologically. So he's saying we don't understand, and these two things are very much connected. So a realism is pretty much inherently theological. That to say that things actually exist as they are says that God created a world that has order, and he created brains that can actually comprehend the world as it is, because we are all divine creations. We share in the Imago Dei. As we share in that Imago Dei, we can really understand the world as it is. And the critical theorists are quite opposed to religion in many ways. Walter Benjamin would be the one very significant exception to that, who is a very faithful Jew. So Adorno then rejects the strong divide between subject and object. That I am a subject who looks at objects around me and understands what those objects are, because we're all part of the same thing, right? So if I am not a subject looking to nature as an object, instead I'm just part of nature too, we got to break down this divide between subject and object. And this is something that starts with Hegel. And it's a critique really of Kant that shows up in Hegel and in a lot of these thinkers. And I'm realizing how much I really need to do one of these on Kant and Hegel, because I keep keep referencing them. And maybe I should have started with Kant or Hegel. This is just the stuff that I've been reading and wanted to get it out there while I'm thinking about it. Instead of Kant and Hegel, I've gone over and over again. So those I feel like I could kind of do at any time, because I've done a lot of reading over many years, whereas this has been a kind of crammed session of reading lots of books and articles and listening to lots of lectures. Okay. Very significant point here that we've talked about before, and I said this in Marx. There is no transcendental subject, and this is part of their critique of the Enlightenment. So there is no inner self. There is no transcendent I that is over and above or distinct from the things around me. Everything has to be understood in relation to the whole. We used this term before of totality to explain Hegel's perspective, which is then borrowed by Marx and Lukács, and now among the critical theorists. Consciousness itself, Adorno was going to say, is determined by social and economic circumstances. That is really significant, because historically, in a classical approach, or a Christian approach, which is part of the classical approach, we would say that consciousness is essentially the reality of the soul. So there is an individual soul, a transcendent soul that has value, that ascends above and beyond my social relationships. That doesn't mean my social relationships are not in some sense essential to who I am, but I still have an essence that exists underneath those relationships, regardless of how important those relationships are. But he says consciousness itself, so even the internal experience of the world, is determined itself by social and economic circumstances. So we see the conflation of the self now with economics and society, so that we are not in any way different from society. We are society. Everything is societally and economically determined. As I've mentioned many times, this shows up over and over and over again in the postmodernists. And this is what leads to our current issues surrounding gender, because we have the question of, well, what is gender? Is it something that is inherent to the self or our essence? Well, if there is no transcendent essence and everything is just determined by economic circumstances and society, then so is whether you're a male or female. And I said before that I think this in some ways is the primary question, is maybe in most basic terms, do I have a soul or not? Do I have a soul? Because if I don't have a soul, that changes everything pretty significantly. And a lot of these ideas are really just different ways to work out the conviction that there is no soul. And the conviction, and the question of how do I live out life if there is no soul? In a historic sense, okay? So I'm not saying you can't in any of these figures see that there's any talk of soul, but it doesn't mean what it did classically. There is a conflation of nature and history here. And so the critique of the Enlightenment is, and there's some validity to this critique as well, the critique of the Enlightenment is the Enlightenment saw that we could just understand nature purely by rational scientific laws. And there's this privileging of the laws of non-contradiction. We could think about the laws of logic in some way, not quite in an Aristotelian sense, but the laws of logic, right? The conclusions of logic, the scientific laws, those have reality that is far above the reality of nature. And you get this especially in someone like Kant, because you have in Kant these transcendental ideas that you can understand and come to rational conclusions about that you can actually know. But then we're talking about history, it's all just phenomena, so I don't really know one thing or another. So the conclusions I come up with in my brain by just rational thinking, those things are true, and the things that I encounter in this world are really subjective experience. So this is a wrong understanding of the world. And certainly in Christianity, our perspective on truth is that all truth is in our world and the way that we experience it really founded upon a historical event, which is the resurrection of Christ. And Adorno is seeing that kind of divide between reason or laws of nature and history and saying we can't divorce the laws of nature from history. Nature exists within history. And even, however, in using terms like nature or history, Adorno is going to quickly correct himself to say, to be clear, these definitions are in constant flux. And so everything for Adorno, any question that he answers about truth or morality or the essence of anything, he's going to say, well, it's constantly shifting. So there's a constant shift in terms of what is true or what is real or what things mean. So he's not going to argue like Socrates, as portrayed by Plato, does, who's always asking people questions like, well, what is justice? And he's seeking to come to an eternal, unchanging definition of things that really exist. Adorno is going to say there is no unchanging definition. These things just shift all the time as culture changes and as the world grows. So here's a quote from Adorno. He says that the unchanging is truth, and the mobile, transient, mere appearance, the indifference of temporal and eternal ideas to each other can no longer be asserted. So what he's saying is there is no difference between these eternal, always valid ideas and then changing history. There's one and the same. So meaning is only found not in something transcendental, but in our finite historical existence. Okay, then he comes up with what is called negative dialectics. And in Hegel's, this comes from Hegel. So in Hegel, we talked about this dialectic, Hegelian dialectic, where we have this process throughout history of one idea coming to prominence, and then someone contradicts that idea, and then out of that develops this synthesis of those ideas. And this is part of the growth of the Geist, or the world spirit, that we see in Hegel. But he sees it all kind of moving in a very positive direction. Now, so what we see in Adorno is there is a negative dialectics. There isn't always this greater unity that we can just see coming. And of course, the utopian ideas that we have, at least of some of the early Hegelians, they're going to be rejected because we've just seen 2 world wars and mass death and authoritarianism in various forms. So we're not so optimistic about the world now as maybe we once were. And maybe we had a brief period in the 1990s, stick again until 9/11. Like we've got these little glimpses of things are getting better, and then quickly we see the evils of humanity. So he rejects, as I've already said, the noumenal-phenomenal divide of Kant, because we're really all part of this same thing. I'm not the transcendental subject that has access to just phenomena that are a part of these noumena apart from me. There's a lot more to say about that, but I'm going to save that for our discussion of Hegel. So if you're confused, don't worry, I'll keep moving on, but we'll get to that in another talk. Okay, unity between subject, object. As I've said, there is no just I am the subject, nature is the object. I am part of nature. We encounter each other, and we are part of this one single reality. There's not really a distinction between, me and nature, me and you in other ways. But this dialectical process is not a positive one. So the dialectical process is not just this achievement of greater synthesis all the time, that we're constantly gaining synthesis and there's unity in ideas. He sees things as rather different. Because what we're going to see in Adorno is he argues that there is a lot of kind of contradiction in the world, and that instead of this higher synthesis, what we really have to do is just recognize and affirm the contradictions that exist. So what he says is unity, then, the kind of unity that Hegel is going to say is part of the growth of the Geist, or the world spirit, he's going to say that really is something that we impose upon subjects by our minds because we want to suppress diversity. So ultimately, diversity is the ultimate good, and we have to allow for diversity. And this attempt for higher unity is not always good, but it's often something that we force on things because we want things to have unity. And in trying to force unity, that's where we actually cause conflict and create the ongoing conflicts of society. And that's what's holding us back from a true revolution that's going to bring about some kind of utopian ideal. So this unity occurs that we try to force through the equalization of exchange value and use value, so that what you pay in order to get some kind of commodity actually equals whatever the value of that thing is in terms of how you use it, what its use is. So he is seeing that there is this economic base. So even though we've already seen he's gone far beyond economics, he's dealing with all sorts of various, philosophical issues, it's all still grounded in economics. So it's all still grounded in the capitalist system in some way. So he says then that the facts of reason, which we were looking at someone like Kant in the Enlightenment, they must be balanced by the facts of unreason, as he calls them. And unreason, he's not saying things that aren't true, because he rejects a correspondence theory of truth that says that which is true is that which corresponds with reality. But instead, that which is unreason is suffering in the world. And this is the dilemma that he has. As we've seen, this is all coming out of the World War II context. I mean, he's a Jewish man looking at World War II, kind of makes sense, right? He's seeing there is death and horrific, genocide happening. And how do we deal with that? There is suffering in the world. And so he calls this unreason. So he's trying to say we've got to just leave in tension the fact of reason that the Enlightenment taught us. He's not saying throw out reason, with the unreason of the destruction that we've seen in the West in recent history. He talks about the priority of the object over the subject. So in a way, as we've said, there's no real strong subject-object divide anyway in Adorno, so he's not going to have a strong division between these. But he's going to say that instead of me saying I stand over and above this world or nature, I actually, as a subject, I'm constituted by the nature that's around me. So I'm not dominating nature. In some way, nature determines who I am. And what is that nature that we encounter as human beings? A lot of the time it's society. So society essentially constitutes us as beings. So I don't have some kind of divinely created being via a soul, but my own being is constituted by the structures of society, largely the economic structures of society. So he says, no object can be fully known by identitarian thinking, or identarian thinking, and that's a word that I have only seen in Adorno, and I did some looking, I don't see it anywhere else, but that is essentially thinking according to what class something belongs to, or what it symbolizes. So we can't just say that we put an identity on a particular thing. We could think of as we said, the classical realist perspective, that when I see a dog, I put it in the class of dog because it really shares in that essence. He says nothing can be fully known just by saying that's what it belongs to. We have to understand everything in a holistic context beyond that. So the telos, or the goal of our thought, if our thought is functioning properly in Adorno's perspective, then we recognize objects as they are instead of trying to impose our identity on them. So I just accept it as it is. I don't personally say this, you are this, or this is that. I don't impose anything on anybody. I just recognize it as it is. And this has to do, again, with his rejection of this transcendental self, that we actually have access to a world that we are, apart from, but also involved in some way. So he sees dialectics as really a thinking in contradiction. And he says, essentially, if we just allow contradictions to stand, if we don't try to bring forth some kind of higher unity, then the antagonism will disappear. Because what is conflict other than my idea contradicts your idea, or my existence contradicts your existence, and we have to bring forth a unity by destroying one? And he says, no, as soon as we let things just stand as they are, all the antagonism disappears. And once we have that, we have this utopian society. So he speaks about a utopian hope that is in our future. And it's important to say here that when we're talking about Adorno, he is rather utopian in his early writings and is increasingly more pessimistic. And he's criticized for this very heavily, because the revolutions he was hoping for, the changes that he's hoping to see, aren't really happening in the way that he hoped to see them. Okay, and we are almost at an hour here. And I'm looking at the time, and there's still a bit more to discuss. So I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to end this talk, and then I'm going to continue recording and do a part 2 of this, because it's just going to be too long for me to, I think, get through all of this within a reasonable period of time. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. This next one may be shorter. It may not go a full hour. That's okay. I'm just going to divide it up into 2 because I don't want these to go too much over an hour, and we are just 5 minutes under that. But I hope you like this. Make sure you do subscribe, and make sure you subscribe on your podcast app as well. And I hope you enjoyed this and will continue watching this series and the other things that we do on this channel. So thanks so much, and God bless.